What if the institutions designed to help us understand the human psyche are actually afraid of them? Hosted by Dr. Michael Montgomery, this podcast explores the uncomfortable questions. Together we'll examine how the mental health systems meant to heal us instead perpetuate cycles of dependency. Welcome to the Psychophobia podcast.
You look great. You look all relaxed.
Yeah. I've been here for a month now.
Wow.
It's been really, really, really incredible. So I'm on the northern end of the Anechoic Peninsula, currently in Nosara.
Wow.
I took a surf lesson this morning, which was really fun.
I was so envious. It just feels so exotic.
It's been so beautiful. But I'm happy to see you. And I'm sorry that it's been kind of challenging to schedule this time.
Actually, it worked out okay because we've been constantly trying to refine the production values in the studio, and so I've literally changed camera and got more lights and signs. And so what began as a small project has sort of turned into something a little bit bigger. Delighted to see you because I feel that we had that sort of intense meeting and encounter, and then there's been a sort of a gap, probably a gap to process and to think about it. And
yeah.
Usually what I do is I show you something and then ask you what your response is. So I'm going to show you this. You tell me what you think.
Well, to me, it looks like a man who is either in charge or believes he's in charge.
I like your analytic. So that is not that's not a man. That is the man. That is Sigmund Freud. But I didn't know whether you recognized it because what I did is it was a classic photograph. So I took some inspiration from some of the art that you and Steve had showed me, the autistic artist.
Oh, yeah.
And then I kind of played around with his image and sort of AI type graphics to see what would happen. So, but yeah, so the link for me with Freud's very contentious, but to me symbolizes something that is getting squeezed out both clinically and, if you like, in our common parlance, and that's the unconscious. And it was one of the big takeaways of visiting you in the lab, many takeaways, but I kept coming back to this juxtaposition between you and Steve talking about evidence and science, but yet talking about the unconscious. And that really fascinated me, both just in how you approach life, your engagement with everything, and very much the work that you do there, and also the tie-in with neurodiversity. That blew my mind hearing both of you talk about that. So that was the opener.
Yeah, we had I think you're right in that it took some time to digest the experience for sure. And my preference is typically, intensity followed by an extreme lack of intensity. I like existing at one or the other end of the spectrum, and the in between, as well. But yeah, I just wanted to say that it was just such a charming experience to have you with us. Steve and I have both reflected on it as the beginning of a friendship and hopefully some interesting projects, including the one that you're in the middle of right now.
Yeah, it's really been fascinating because, well, firstly, thank you for saying that. The memory is kind of surreal because it was such a perfect day with meeting you right up to, having the meal. And then the context of the backdrop of everything that was going on in Minneapolis, it was like, wow, it's so strange to have this meeting, but yet the backdrop, it was all going off, and the weather and that. But the response from people has not ended. The curiosity and the interest in both the chamber and just your work, and the number of people who've reached out who I think have connections with you and Steve, just to say, oh, has been very worthwhile. The other thing that has really moved me is I've had people reading what I was writing about tying in with mental health, and that is really spoken to people, particularly people who've got loved ones who they feel are kind of trapped. They've maybe lost contact with consensual reality, and their mind is bringing up very frightening experiences for them, which was the whole initial approach, to sit in the chamber and then for me to face what came up in my mind. So I've literally had to say to people, look, I was able to sit there and I came up against what I was bringing, but I've done years of training in silence and meditation and psychoanalysis. You know, your loved one maybe could be in their early 20s. They haven't had any of those inputs or training. So whatever is there will come up. And I said that if I had have been that age and tried it, I probably wouldn't have come out alive. You know, in terms of what my own unconscious would have brought up at that time. So I've had to give a lot of context to it, but it really has stimulated conversations around your work, around silence, around confronting our own fear. So it really touched all the things that I had hoped for and much more. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I'm so happy to hear that it really resonated deeply. And I think that that was, in many ways, the expectation, you know.
People did freak out around me for going in. You know, psychophobia was apparent. You know, it generated all the things that I thought it would. So today I just wanted to challenge you a little bit in some of the things you said and then get into it a little bit, because you challenged me in many of the things that you said. The first thing I wanted to ask you about was the whole concept of silence. When I researched silence, I actually wrote about the lab. I never thought I would get there. The most quiet place I got to on Earth was, I think, in Arizona, up some mountain. And as I sat down, Steve uses the language to explain. It's like a shift in perception, right? So the minute I hit the pure silence, then I start to hear everything else. The rocks move, the insects, my own tinnitus. Right? And when I researched everyone who'd gone into chambers, they often came up with the same sort of thing. But the minute I went into the chamber, I immediately went into the connection with stillness. So my question was, when we talk about silence, are we actually talking about something else in that moment, in that experience, in the chamber? Because I think the broader conversation is how do you make that therapeutically accessible?
Right.
So what are we actually talking about when people have that experience of what we're calling silence?
Silence in the chamber. One thing that we spoke about that I keep coming back to with my clients, the patients that I'm working with in the Anechoic chamber, you, myself, is that we can't reflect on our experience in the anechoic chamber. You can't reflect on your experience in the anechoic chamber based on the lack of light or based on the lack of sound. You can really only reflect on it based on what's left, right? So when you're in an environment that's acoustically very, very quiet and visually completely dark, and there's no difference between your eyes being open and closed, you've lost the two main ways in which you're connected to the world, in which you're connected to yourself, in which we're connected to each other. And those two things anchor us to our reality, in addition to, of course, our other senses as well. And so the biggest piece of clarification that I'd like to make is that silence is thought of as an acoustical issue. And it is an acoustical issue, but it's also an issue that manifests across all of the other ways in which we perceive the world. And so we'll often refer to silence as acoustical silence, silence as visual silence, silence as thermal silence, right? We'd like to clarify on top of just the word silence what modality we're speaking about. So my view on silence is that it's absolutely a multisensory issue. My view is that unless you're isolated to one particular modality, just vision, just sound, just, the way in which your body is thermally experiencing an environment, which we very seldom are. We very seldom have isolated sensory experiences. You can't really achieve silence if it's not cared for and amplified in every area, if that makes sense. So we like to speak about it as a multisensory issue, and that's been one of the largest guiding principles in our design work and our architectural design and research work for decades. And it's also what's become the launching place for the therapeutics program that I've been building out of the lab as well.
So there was an immediate quality in the chamber, but my sense was that quality I was familiar with and could recognize if I was in Times Square. But I could easily forget being in Times Square, whereas the chamber brought me into it immediately, like rapidly.
Right.
So is it necessarily what we're calling silence, or is it the shift? Like if you're in a room with people in silence meditating, it's very unusual to be in a room with people in silence. Like
yes.
when people do a minute's silence, they usually do it for like 15 seconds. They don't even do the whole minute.
Yeah, it's almost like being in a room with people and all being silent is like, it's defying the metaphors of what it means to be in a room with many people.
Yeah.
Right? Because metaphorically, to be in a room full of, or not just metaphorically, literally, right? Literally speaking, to be in a room with many people, it often implies noise.
Yeah.
It often implies commotion. So I agree with you there.
So I think I might have said this. So I was meditating a lot on my own, and it's been a while since I'd sort of living in a group setting. And I went to the Quaker church.
Yeah, you did mention that.
So immediately struck by how different it was sitting with others than it was sitting on my own. And then, of course, it was the noise of the benches creaking, and it's like, wow, this is actually so noisy. But you wouldn't ordinarily hear that because there's so many other things that you're bringing in. Really powerful experience, just to sit with people that you don't know for 1 hour in silence, and not saying you're meditating. You're just sitting in silence, and you're waiting for what comes up. So. And again, it's like the John Cage orchestra
demonstration
piece, which he writes a lot about. So what would be enough? I know you talked about altering the level of silence to make it therapeutic, but what would it be that could recreate that experience of this is a very new perceptual experience for people? Because what I hear you say is when people go in there with you, your clients and stuff, patients, they often report really positive.
Absolutely.
Veteran, you name it. It's like, wow, there's something happening here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I'll answer your question in a few parts. One thing which I think you were kind of alluding to is, silence is relative. And so if I have a client that is living in a busy neighborhood in New York City, in order for them to be immersed in silence, they really need to be immersed in an environment that demonstrates enough contrast, right? If I have a client that's living out in the woods, with very few people around them, they're not in the flight path, it's very quiet. Well, I also need to demonstrate some sense of contrast, right, as well. And so I think it's relative to the user. I think it's relative to the occupant, to whoever the client is. And so that's what I mean when I say I think silence is relative, right? My view is that you don't need to be in a negative, 26 DBA environment in order to be immersed in silence. And there's a few technical reasons for that. One being that 0 decibels is considered the threshold of perfect infant hearing. The other piece is, and so that's beyond what's considered within our hearing age range. The other piece is I think that we can demonstrate contrast, we can achieve silence and demonstrate difference without such an extreme, which is something that, we're absolutely looking at in the PTSD study that we're working on and that we're considering as we go further into developing our therapeutics program.
And, you talk about taking away the two things, the silence and light. How important is the darkness to the experience, do you think?
It's very important because if the lights are on, your vision is your perceptual anchor. And so the experience is meant to be, overwhelmingly about being able to absorb what it's like to be in an acoustically very, very quiet space. If the lights are on, you're not able to absorb that as much because you're anchored to your ability to see what's around you. So I'm fascinated by the fact that whether we look at Eastern medicine or Western medicine or more homeopathic approaches for medicine, less homeopathic approaches for medicine. Across the board, it's about what do we add on to make ourselves feel better, right? Feel better, feel more alive, feel more connected. And what we're working with and what I'm very curious about is what happens when we start taking things away. What happens via the process of elimination. And since our ability to perceive is the only reason why we know we're here, what better area to work with? So,
this was a big one for me, right? So, I'm going to come back to that. I want to ask you quickly, did you say homeopathic medicine?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I'm very interested in homeopathic medicine. I'm interested in general in terms of my own personal health and getting to the root cause. I accept Eastern and Western medicine, and I am very integrative in my approach in terms of my health personally. I also feel that the two inform one another in significant ways. So I don't have a singular relationship with either. I use both. But being somebody that is less interested in masking a problem and more interested in solving the problem and getting to the root cause, not just in terms of my health, but in terms of essentially every area in my life. I find it to be very interesting, and it's helped me in many ways, having studied it.
Because it gets a lot of bad press. All I can say about it is I used to have chronic hay fever, and I took homeopathic hay fever, and it went away. I had it for until I was about 20, and then I took this homeopathic, and it just went away. And I hadn't heard the sort of more negative discussion of homeopathy, but like it worked. What else is there to say? And I did recommend it to other people, and it didn't work. But yeah, sorry. I was just interested in what your thought there. I like what you said though about it's. I think you're inferring you'll use whatever works.
I'll use whatever works. That being said, my instinct, if I have the ability, the resources, access, and whatnot, I'll go towards a treatment modality that is looking at the root cause.
That's good. Okay, so say your phrase again, so we get it word for word about what's when you take perception away.
Since our ability to perceive is the only reason why we know we're here.
So that you said that a few times when I was last with you, and it really stuck with me. So define perceive.
Well, perceive is essentially us absorbing what's happening in the world around us.
So you're talking about the senses?
Yes.
So smell, taste, touch. sight.
Right.
So I take those away. What are you left with?
So if you take away, I mean, we spoke about this when you were in Minneapolis, right? Because you have some views about a sixth or a seventh or an eighth sense, sense that exists, which I'm very interested in. From a perceptual angle, if I can't see you, if I can't hear you, if I can't feel you, if I can't, if I don't have any of these other things on a perceptual angle, there is nothing left.
But what about the mind?
I think that in order for the mind to be connected, we need all of those other things to perceive more clearly.
So when I was very, very young, I used to reflect on this a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So what if I took away my perception, what would be left? And then I used to have these wild dreams where the dreams were of having kind of no perception. So like nearly existing except in the mind space. I think from some traditions, the fifth sense would be the mind.
Mm.
Or perhaps the mind with a small m, as in thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
If you were able to take all those away in some sort of a super advanced chamber, surely you would still have awareness of your thoughts. That's probably the only thing you could be left to be aware of, and awareness itself. So that you could say 6.
Mm. Well, I think that, from the perspective of, sensory science and the work at our lab, removing the external senses does not remove the mind. What remains is consciousness itself. What remains is internal perception, thoughts, memories, imagination, the body's internal signals, heartbeat, breathing, blood flow, awareness of time passing, emotion, and cognition. So, in the anechoic chamber, experiments and experiences that I'm running with clients, when external stimuli approach zero, people begin to perceive the internal landscape of the body and of the mind itself. And so they hear their heartbeat. They notice subtle muscle tension. Thoughts become louder because there's nothing competing with them.
Mm. So, because people like Jean-Paul Sartre, they would argue consciousness always has to have an object. Right? That's complicated, but what you're saying is definitely your. So when I use the mind, I'm talking about really about the aspect of being that is aware. So that is mind with a capital N for me, and then mind with a small m is kind of our thoughts or ideas of who we are, the things that are not constant.
Mm.
Whereas I see mind with a capital M as pure, unconfined, spacious, never changing.
Mm.
Like the blue sky that's always there, as opposed to the clouds that come and go.
Mm. I think, when the outside world disappears, the internal world becomes more perceptible.
Mm.
So in a scientific sense, what's left is the human perceptual system observing itself. And philosophically, you might say, when the senses fall silent, what remains is awareness.
So could be onto something here. So is it then an accelerator into that space? The chamber?
Yes.
I dropped right in to what I recognized as very familiar, but it was kind of rapid. So the point was it came up rapidly, Whereas in Times Square, if you said, okay, drop into pure awareness and stillness, I could do it. I wouldn't be distracted. I just might need to remember more quickly than I would as when I went in the chamber, because it was like, boom.
Mm.
So therapeutically then, would it be an accelerator to people coming into contact with their own awareness?
Absolutely.
Ooh, that's exciting, right?
It's very exciting.
Because for some people, so when I first started meditating, and when I mean, meditation is such a misused word. So when I started practicing mindfulness of breathing, it took me a year before I had any sense of what my mind was like when my thoughts settled. It's kind of like, why am I doing this? It's like my mind's all over. Then one day it was like, poof. Right, there was a recognition of a stillness, of an awareness that was that transcended my everyday experience to the point where the clouds became less dominant, and I could see them as fleeting. But that took a year. What I'm hearing you say, I think, is people who are drawn to it come in with you and have some sort of experience more or less immediately in that territory. Would that be right?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you remove the normal inputs to the perceptual system, sight, sound, and other sensory cues, perception itself doesn't disappear. The brain doesn't shut down. What happens instead is that the perceptual system begins to self-reference. So without external stimuli, people start to notice all the internal signals that we were discussing. And so the experience becomes less about the outside world and becomes more about observing the internal landscape of perception. So in that sense, environments like the anechoic chamber don't create awareness. They simply remove the noise that normally occupies attention. So when that noise is reduced, awareness naturally turns inward. So, I don't think that the chamber adds anything to perception. I think it subtracts the external world into the until the perceptual system then begins to observe itself.
I love that. To me, the awareness is always there, but we fail to recognize it. So arguably in the more advanced Tibetan meditation practices, if you like, you get to the point where the meditation is non-meditation. So if you like, meditation training is doing something to get to the point where you can recognize and rest in awareness. But when you're resting and recognizing awareness, you're not actually doing anything, because there's nothing to be done, only to recognize. But what I have observed is, I used to live in more or less a monastery, Buddhist monastery, and people would come on retreat, and it would take about at least 2 days for them to begin to settle. They're bringing their lives, their problems, their hustle bustle. They were joining a community of really dedicated, heavy-duty practitioners. It took about 2 days to things to settle, and then maybe another couple of days for the retreat to go deeper and deeper. My sense from the chamber was there was something captured of that essence more or less immediately. Now, I don't know whether that was me. I don't think it was, because I think what I'm hearing you say is all sorts of people are having an experience that has value to them very quickly. And I'm not overly prizing quickness, because that would be in the area of McDonaldization, but just more that there is real benefit potentially in this. I think you had mentioned when I was there, I was just fascinated by the opportunity to roll this out in a way that makes it more accessible, that perhaps doesn't need the level of silence, but you do create a space where people can experience it to enough degree that make it therapeutic. Where are you with that, do you think?
Yeah, so well, maybe I can give a little bit of background into this. The Therapeutics program, as you know, is very new. It's just something that we've been doing over the past couple of years, and it followed my spending a significant amount of time in the anechoic chamber for two primary reasons. One reason was I was interested in immersing myself for consistent periods of time. And I was interested in taking my meditation practice in there. And the second piece is that I was starting to self-diagnose with a variety of sensory processing issues that in many ways I had known and thought that I had had for many years, but was never properly diagnosed. I think it's becoming more and more common for people to self-diagnose, as in their adult years. And that certainly happened to me. And that's probably a result of the work I'm doing and just as a strong personal interest. Historically, people have come to our lab in order to be immersed in all of our work. We're set up as an immersive facility. As you know, we feel very strongly that you can spend time trying to convince people of this or that, but it's much easier if you have the opportunity for them to convince themselves. And immersing them in our various labs and immersing them in the anechoic chamber is much more meaningful. It's easier for them to understand what's going on. So the anechoic chamber, which is traditionally a product testing environment, following my really committing to spending time in there, I started opening it up to other people. And something clicked for me. And that was that I realized that we'd never created a strong definition, a strong narrative about what the chamber was meant to do for people. So it's internationally known. It's gotten all sorts of press for being a space that's challenging, right? When you think of silence and when you think of darkness, a lot of people are afraid. And that's a narrative that exists in a lot of different areas when it comes to things like sensory deprivation, which, by the way, has a very bad rap. And we don't use that terminology because of that.
I was just going to say, so that just want to interject there because that's really interesting, because the thing about sensory deprivation is people pay for it and also it's punishment. So back to what you said about the context is very, very important.
Absolutely.
But this idea, to me, this is the center of kind of my world. I use the word pharmakon, which is a Greek word, which could be translated as a poison and a cure. So for some people, silence and darkness has great appeal, and for other people, they're terrified of it.
Right.
For some people, being admitted to hospital can save their life. For other people, it can potentially ruin their life. We have to stick with those two, which is basically what the asterisk represents. It represents that these things are in the territory of nuance and complexity, and we don't necessarily have all the answers to it, but we need to ask these difficult questions. So sorry, I had to jump in because I think it's fascinating. The fact that people would pay for silence and the fact that people would be punished by silence fascinates me.
Well, and I'm actually, it is a really interesting paradox. Humans will pay to enter environments of reduced sensory input, and yet sensory deprivation, as you said, has been used historically as a form of punishment or torture. I think the question isn't simply about sensory deprivation. It's about whether the mind experiences the environment as a place of safety and curiosity or as a place of uncertainty and threat, right? And that nuance exists across, we could talk for hours about all the things in which, there's lots of things in the world where some people choose to experience it as pleasure and some people choose to experience it as the opposite of that, right? Sure. But there is something that I would like to get into that's come to mind based on what you're saying. And that's that the way that I have set up these sessions, the way that I'm facilitating, my belief in my belief in the anechoic chamber's potential in silence and darkness and perhaps other modalities of reduced sensory input. I really believe that it could be a strong, strong therapeutic modality. And that experience being held by somebody that feels that, I think is part of what creates that place of safety and curiosity rather than a place of, uncertainty or threat. And so part of my designing these sessions and kind of founding this program has been about trying to be exquisitely clear about what the narrative is, not because we think that something is going to always happen to somebody when they walk in there. We don't talk about what the outcome is supposed to be. We don't talk about what it's meant to achieve, what you're meant to achieve. We simply speak about the anechoic chamber and the experience as a lubricant upon whatever, I think, as I said to you when you were with us, a lubricant in hopefully a very positive way.
So are you in the territory of set and setting? Because you present with a commanding presence and stillness and confidence. So, as a guide, I would easily resonate towards you. Well, I did. You took me into the chamber. But do you think that, are you saying that there's something about being in relationship with the guide that helps it become grounded and more meaningful, as opposed to the contrast, which would be a seclusion ward, for instance, in a psychiatric facility where people are perhaps throwing in their, throwing might be the wrong word, but often they are throwing, and then it's sort of excluded from sensory stimulation. Right? You're in a way partnering with them on that journey to some extent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and most people that are coming, my clients, when I meet them for the first time, many of them have never been in an environment that's completely dark. Many of them have never been in an environment that's extremely quiet acoustically. So they're having a profound experience just because of that. I've done a lot of work with groups, and I'm transitioning more to working one-on-one with individuals. And I'm not a clinical psychologist. I have a cognitive and perceptual psychology background. But I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. And so I am, sorry?
I wouldn't even say that, because you'd wipe the floor with most therapists I've met. It's about awareness. It's about self-reflection. It's about humility. It's about meeting the people with a non-judgmental. And I think a lot of that can be polluted by overtraining and theory, and so I think it's an advantage in your case rather than disadvantage.
Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. I feel that there's a strong energy exchange that goes on between me and the people that are coming in. And despite being in a very professional environment, and despite being the person facilitating or being the guide, I feel that I also learn a lot about myself through my clients and people that are coming in as well. So it's extremely fluid.
Beautiful. I love it. So you said something. I don't know how much you want to talk about your own experience. I'll certainly reveal if you reveal, right? But for some people, I certainly became much more aware of noise after the chamber. It's driving me. Oh my goodness, it's just overwhelming, the level of noise that we deal with. But you mentioned something about the world, and I immediately went to this idea of safety. So I think when people are in distress, they seek safety. And what they do not receive is safety. So, for example, in many states, if you were to phone for services in distress, you'll get an ambulance, a fire truck, and a police car.
Mm.
So imagine you're in a state of emotional, mental distress, and you open the door and that's what you see. That's not safety. Or you go to hospital and you're taken away by security. Very common occurrence that I witness. But there are also people that the world, for different perceptual reasons, perhaps let's say that to begin with, is very frightening and jarring, and certain spaces are particularly frightening and jarring. My sense is both you and Steve have really, really, really tuned into this and actually are marrying the two. You know, your deep understanding of silence and the benefits, acoustics, architecture, right? Some of the stuff that you were telling me about what you've designed and how you've designed it and how you thought of it's like off the scale exciting. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yes, certainly. I'd be happy to. Well, you know, Steve and I both self-identify as being sensitive and likely hypersensitive. And so we have the pleasure of working for a population that we're included in, right? Which I think people are often best at working for a demographic if they resemble that demographic themselves, you know, if they resemble that population personally. I consider myself a hypersensitive person, and as I mentioned before, I have a variety of sensory processing issues that I've noticed for, you know, multiple decades in my life, but have thought of more seriously recently. And I think that when you get into this field, which is quite a niche, right? Steve was really the first person that we know of globally that's taken a multisensory approach to architecture. He's taken a multisensory approach to product development. And as far as I know, I'm the first person that's taken a multisensory approach to therapeutics within the context of a built environment condition, right? Mm-hmm. And so our sensitivity probably has partially to do with the fact that that's our nature, and partially to do with the fact that we're existing within this continuum that's been relatively like left alone, hasn't really been looked at broadly, you know, among other people.
I really do believe that your work is unique. So I also believe people are always meant to meet particular times. So I am also in that hypersensitive club, but I only realized in the last probably a year because I thought my hypersensitivity was trauma related. Growing up in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and so I followed the emotional, the psychoanalytic, all these different routes. And I guess there was an element of trauma, but then I realized there's a hypersensitivity and way of organizing the world that I had, the term I've learned is masked, right? And I masked it in ways that I didn't realize I was masking it, but it was my way of coping. Now that I'm not masking and I'm really, really aware, it's kind of like overwhelming. And then I'm seeing it in places that I hadn't seen before. And it's this split between primarily a mental health focus being kind of separate, more separate from maybe a neurodiverse focus. So it's like all these different areas, sometimes they don't communicate with each other. So people are getting the wrong support, the wrong treatment, or no treatment or support at all. And one of my aversions to that whole area of sensitivity was the over-labeling and diagnosis and over-medication. And in a way, I think it made me a place of denial in my own experience, because I sort of pushed it away because I was angry about the system.
Mm.
Once you see it, you you can't unsee it.
Right. It should come with a warning sign, right?
Yeah.
Warning, once your eyes are open, you won't want to close them.
Yeah. But I also have, I mean, that term sensitivity is beautiful, but I also have this issue with people appropriating the term because they have a right to do so, but then dictating what that term should or does mean for everyone else.
Mm.
It's a bit like, it becomes more division and more groups.
Mm.
And then there's nearly like an oppression where other people can't talk about it unless they identify in a particular way or use a particular language. And so I'm kind of torn with the complexity of that.
Yes, I'm also torn with the complexity of it. I think, Steve and I speak a lot about how there are these really broad terms that people refer to as if they're much more narrow or much more defined. Sustainability is a great example of that, right? What do you mean? What do you mean by sustainability? What's your definition of sustainability? Well-being. What's your definition of well-being? So I think that, I'm with you. I'm with you on this for sure.
So what's the answer?
The answer is to create clear definitions. The answer is to be more specific, and to push people to say what they think, and to push people to be more specific, because I don't feel that people don't want to create clear definitions. I feel that people are not encouraged to be clearer.
Yeah. There's definitely a dumbing down. There's definitely a desire to have easy boxes, right? It's like I saw, actually I won't go in there because it's too controversial. But I'm presenting in April at a conference, and I think it's called, my paper's Unboxed Realities, and it comes from the misdiagnosis of people and then the treatment. So I'm not offering potentially any solutions, but I'm trying to give specific or more specific definitions to categories that we don't fully understand yet, but we need to be aware of. So, for example, certain people get very triggered and elevated when other people don't understand them. And they don't understand why people can't understand what they're saying. And that elevated reaction can be seen as some sort of like mental health crisis. But when you get up close and personal and take the time to understand the conflict, you can begin to see that some people have a way of organizing and seeing the world that is very unique to them. And the person that they're encountering doesn't see the world in that way. But it's much more fixed than just holding a view. It's actually the person doesn't have the ability to see the other perspective, in that moment at least.
Right.
And I see it even within families. And what I see is I'm going to use the word subclinical presentation, say in a father, and a very clinical presentation, say in a daughter. And what happens is when they get into conflict, the subclinical response gets triggered. So you get an elevated conflict between two individuals who fundamentally don't understand each other and possibly in that moment don't have the capacity. But from the outside looking in, it's really clear how they're missing. in those situations, the complexity is often denial.
Mm.
So you take you and Steve, right? Myself, we're tuned in to some of the sensitivities, and we're able to accommodate and work with it. For some people, if you try and bring in the sensitivity, there's an outright rejection of it, which means it's really difficult then to support them or the family or the friends and colleagues around them.
Mm.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that misunderstanding often comes from a limitation of perspective, and the mind tends to collapse complexity into something that's simpler. But when we become curious about another person's point of view, what once looked unusual or difficult can begin to look like a very particular kind of originality.
Yeah. Because if you've a tribe, if no one had a level of sensitivity, you have a problem.
Mm.
If everyone in a team is super positive, then there's no attention to risk. You need some people to be a little bit paranoid.
You need contrast. You need contrast. You know, I'm often talking about, in terms of lighting, for example, people love when they're lighting a room to put one light in the middle of the room, whether it's on the fan or it's just a central light fixture. And you turn on the light and everything is featured, right? Well, when everything is featured, nothing is featured because you have no sense of contrast in the environment. And so this, what you're explaining, what I think we're talking about now, is something that exists across all these different types of modalities. And I think that I try my best in my life to embrace difference for the sake of embracing contrast, you know?
That's really strong, yeah. Really strong. You know, what's interesting in all that, I got into that space because I had my conflict resolution hat on.
Mm.
So I was introduced to different situations because the person of concern had some sort of extreme crisis, or, you know, was seeming as extremely complicated. When the more extreme crisis dissipated, then there often was still sort of family conflict.
Mm.
So it was me taking a different hat off and going back to sort of mediation and peacekeeping and what is causing the conflict, and then having the aha moment where it's like, wow, you not only do you not see and understand each other, you're going to spend forever trying to shift people to understand, when actually what you need to understand is they can't see that perspective.
Mm.
So you need to come at it from a different approach, a different way. A bit like a kid who's really struggling with executive functioning, and the parents are think it's some sort of moral failing, or their lack of motivation, or their untidiness is because they're just lazy. That's a really common term, right? At school, I was always called lazy, could do better, you know, all this sort of stuff. Very common with dyslexia, because the teachers obviously see the potential and high potential, and they get frustrated. Why is this kid? Well, he must be just lazy because he's got the potential, he's got the intelligence. They don't see all the organizational issues, all the sensitivity issues, the issues in transition, and so on and so on. So it was my desire to understand, and to understand why people are falling out and getting into conflict. So in a way, I came at it from a very, very different angle than you might think. The other thing is I noticed, working very closely with people who had perhaps a mental health diagnosis, that when their frustration with not being understood and their frustration with environments and transitions, when that was witnessed, there was a real settling down. There was like a nearly a shift to embodiment that surprised them and me at the same time. Because what was clear, what was being said to me was things like, why can't my father see this? Or how come you can see this and they can't see this? And that was terribly sad to hear, because they're surrounded by people who perhaps love them, who don't get them. That has to be something that would cause you extreme strife, isolation, disassociation, all those different things. It's kind of like, it was like what was presenting as something else made total sense. It's a bit like the term imposter syndrome. So sometimes people use the term imposter syndrome, and it does mean potential anxiety, like I don't feel good enough, right? But there's also imposter syndrome that's actually not imposter syndrome at all. It's hostility in the environment. I read this article recently by this clinical psychologist that was really brilliant in this. So again, it's back to the nuance. It can be both. It can be my lack of self-belief. You hear the story about MIT. They on the first day, they say, right, put your hands up if you don't think you should be here. Like 90% of the people, right? So that, to me, that's like an anxiety around imposter syndrome, right? Feeling, it's not really a syndrome. The other one is, perhaps I'm a woman of color in a meeting and the men keep interrupting me. I've been there. I've witnessed that, right, myself, where it's like, what is that? Why are you shutting this person down? And the person has been incredibly expressive of gratitude for seeing it and calling it out. But I had learned that when you see it with your own eyes, right? So that person could take that on and think, well, that's me. I don't deserve to be here or whatever. When actually it's the environment, consciously or unconsciously, is causing those feelings of exclusion, or feeling you have to work 10 times harder than somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of going back to what you said about contrast, which I think is really true. In many ways, human perception itself depends on contrast. So we only perceive light because there is darkness. We only recognize quiet because there is sound, noise. And the same principle shows up in many ways in human experiences. So sensitivity and insensitivity, happiness and sadness, and so on and so forth. These contrasts create conditions that allow us to perceive meaning, that allow us to perceive difference. So when somebody appears very different or very difficult to understand, sometimes what we're actually encountering is a form of contrast that reveals something about the broader landscape of the human experience. And when we're able to hold that contrast rather than collapse it into judgment, it often becomes easier to see the coherence and the uniqueness in that person. And I think that is so much easier said than done.
Why do you think that is?
Because I think judgment is part of our nature. Mm. And by the way, I'm not against judgment. I'm also, just in addition to judgment, interested in exploring everything else. I don't think that judgment is necessarily implies a negative. In fact, I think it's an incredibly important asset. But when it comes to people, it's extremely nuanced.
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference between judgment and being judgy.
Yeah, because we could get into the semantics.
Yeah, you love it. So I mean, I'm covering this with the term psychophobia.
Yeah.
it's nearly like the fear of the other, or the fear of difference, or the fear of our own difference even, or our own perceived difference. But there is a tendency to kind of to push away, and without taking the time to understand what that difference is, it can be heavily misinterpreted. So I could tell you a couple of great examples. Being on a clinician on a ward round, terrible experience in London, just watching patients being asked to come into a room full of clinicians and trainees. And I watched how the judgments and interpretations of difference were so off. It was frightening. So the story of the young woman where 10 people agreed she was incoherent. And I was working with her very intensively, and I went, she's funnier than all of you, and she's more intelligent. She's just one question behind. So if you imagine, if I start asking you questions and you're answering the previous question, and the people in the room don't pick up on that, it sounds like you're incoherent. The reason she couldn't answer she was one question behind was because of the level of medication she was on. So I had to bring that to the team's attention. Or a young man of color who they say is getting aggressive when he's in a room with predominantly middle class, white, older men. Because it was psychiatry was like a class, part of the class system in a way. You were more sort of middle class, upper class to be in medicine. So psychiatrists tended to, in England they would talk with posher voices and right. So immediately you're potentially interfacing with a class of people that you've never experienced before, and nor have they experienced you, right? So there's a power dynamic, there's a cultural difference, and you've just taken away this young man's liberty, and you're wondering why he's responding, but you're pathologizing his response. That was mind-blowing when you are there to witness that, to see that mismatch between somebody's lived experience and then how people in a position of authority or judging that with consequence. And the consequence could be your liberty, or worse, it could be forcibly treated with medication or restraints that could make things much worse. So I think it's essential for us to take the time to understand difference and not make too many assumptions that have ramifications over that person's life.
I agree with you. I think it is absolutely essential.
The bad news is I don't think it's getting any better. I think economically, the systems are looking for faster, quicker results. Faster, quicker results don't lend themselves to spending longer times up close and personal with people. It's usually a tick box mentality, a McDonaldization encounter where I have to get through this interview with these predestined questions and I have to tick these boxes. That's not an encounter. Well, it is an encounter, but it's an encounter of sorts, right? Sitting in silence with a veteran who's had a heavy traumatic experience, that's an encounter.
It is. It is. And the veterans population, especially so, because so much of their PTSD is connected to their fight or flight response. So this environment, that population has been really fascinating to work with because of how directly it's connected. I agree that I think that understanding differences is absolutely essential. And I think I think there's lots of examples as to why that's the case. Contrast is what allows us to recognize everything at all. And at the same time, I tend to feel optimistic about where we're going in the world. History shows that as our systems of communication and knowledge expand, people are gradually exposed to more perspectives than ever before. So that doesn't always make things look better in the short term. Sometimes it makes differences more visible, and that can create a lot of tension. But over time, I think that exposure can also expand our capacity to understand one another. So I see this current moment less as decline and more as a kind of transition. So, where we're learning, sometimes in a very clumsy way, how to navigate a world with far more visible diversity of thought, of culture, of experience than ever before. So I think that difference has always existed. What's changing is our ability to see it and to engage with it.
So I'm going to say to you what I said to two other people this week. You're a highly evolved, high vibrational being.
Mm.
I encounter a lot of people who are not in that category, whose consciousness is at the level of the tribe.
Mm.
And they have not got to the position where they can see beyond the tribe and the potential for contrast, collaboration, community, peace beyond their own.
Mm.
And whether that's a manufactured tribe or not, in terms of just like, say, a political identification. But there's this polarization that I see and connect with an emotional regression.
Mm.
So if you like, the child sees good and bad. So it idolizes and denigrates. It can love someone on the playground at the beginning of the break and say, "You're not my friend, I hate you" at the end. As they develop, they see that actually I can love someone and they can do things I don't like.
Mm.
Or I can not like someone and they do things that I do like. Right? That's like the maturing. So they move away from fairy tales and they look for stories that are more complex and less defined. But what I witness in society at the minute is this shift away from that nuance and that contrast to all the good is in our space and all the bad is in your space. That can't possibly be true. There has to be some good and bad on both or all camps. A bit like going into kids and talking about drugs and saying it's all bad. That's a nonsense. Everyone knows that there are some qualities on drugs or else people wouldn't do them in the first place. How do we get people to appreciate nuance, difference, less polarization than they are currently able to accept, do you think?
So many things. How do we get people to embrace nuance? It's interesting because what you're describing also shows up in developmental psychology. Early on, the mind organizes the world in very simple categories: good, bad, safe, unsafe, right and wrong. And those distinctions are useful at first because they help us to orient ourselves. But as people mature, their capacity for nuance ideally expands. We start to recognize that multiple things can be true at the same time. I think that the challenge is that nuance requires a certain kind of stability. So when people feel overwhelmed or they feel threatened, the mind often collapses back into simpler, familiar categories. So part of the question may not be how we force people to embrace nuance, but how we create an environment where people feel safe enough to tolerate complexity.
Okay, so how do you create environments where people can tolerate complexity?
And I think the ability to tolerate complexity is closely tied to the conditions around us. And so when people are overwhelmed, when they're threatened, when they're overstimulated, like I was saying before, the mind naturally simplifies the world into clearer categories. And I think that that's a very protective response. But when the environment is calm, supportive, and allows people to slow down, then their system tends to relax. And when that happens, people often become more capable of holding multiple perspectives at once. So in many ways, I think that the question isn't only intellectual. I think it's environmental. How do we design spaces, conditions, conversations, even social conditions where people feel stable enough to remain curious rather than defensive? When curiosity stays present, nuance becomes much easier to tolerate. And I think that, I think complexity is easier to explore when the environment reduces the need for certainty.
Strong. Do you think as well fear? When you were talking, I thought, can you really ask people to look at the nuance and look at different perspectives if they feel threatened and are fearful?
I think that fear plays a big role in this. When people feel afraid, I think the mind also, naturally simplifies. So nuance requires a certain tolerance for uncertainty. And that means holding ideas that don't resolve immediately into right or wrong. So one of the challenges is that if people are operating in a state of fear or a state of instability, the mind tends to retreat into simpler narratives. I think that if we create environments where people can tolerate complexity, it often means reducing that sense of threat.
Yeah, the thing is, and again, I'm just riffing off what you're saying, is what jumped to mind is certainty is seductive. So actually being a bigot is much easier than holding both perspectives. It's why, like, the easy answer of they're the problem. They're the problem. We're not the problem. They're the problem. Wow, that's good. I like that. I like being on the team that's not the problem. Right. I noticed that growing up in Northern Ireland, kind of when I saw through the futility of that conflict, it was like I missed the simplicity of they're the enemy. Like holding the position of maybe they aren't the enemy. Maybe this is way more complex than I was told growing up. Right. But I remember this point. I remember there was a bunch of, somebody said that some politicians said they should get an incinerator and burn all Catholics. Geordie Seed, right? Actually, he was murdered for it. And somebody repeated this in class, and I stood up and said, "This is wrong. You can't say that." When I got outside, there was a bunch of boys waiting for me to give me a beating, just because I had the audacity to say that's not right. But I remember, like, a few years after, thinking back to, wow, it would have been easier just to hold the non-nuanced position.
Right.
There's an appeal to.
Yes. I think both. I think it's best to embrace. I think it's best to embrace both. I've been having some conversations recently with a friend about how we'd really like to embrace the idea of being less emotionally tied to things. I was taking the surf lesson, and we had some kind of type of little conflict with our surf instructor. And as he was walking away, we were talking about, after kind of monitoring his disposition and, what he was like. And this is very, relaxed California surfer guy who's out here. And we said, he probably isn't walking away with that conflict, and then bringing it with him on his walk back to the surf shop and into and maybe this isn't true, but just for the sake of, exploration. what if part of being emotionally less in tune, say, thinking so deeply, intellectualizing all this, all sorts of things, like, what if there's a sense of peace in that as well, or simplicity. But back to what you were saying before, I think that certainty is seductive because it simplifies how we perceive things. And I think that the human perceptual system is consistently trying to organize complexity into stable patterns. Certainty provides that stability. It allows the mind to stop evaluating alternatives. But the trade-off is that once a pattern feels certain, curiosity tends to diminish. And curiosity is often what allows a deeper understanding to emerge.
Yeah. Once I know or think I know, I close down.
It closes down. Yeah. It's a good correction.
It closes down the curiosity. I think curiosity from a clinical point of view is one of the most important words, to encourage, let's be curious about what's going on here. It's so beautiful, and it has a lightness of touch rather than I know what's going on for you. I know what's wrong. It's more like, I wonder what, let's try and understand what might be going on. That's beautiful. Once I know what's going on, there's less curiosity. Why do you think it killed the cat, though? I was always curious about that, right?
Yeah.
The difficulty is I see with young people, God, I sound old saying young people, right? But sometimes they're given very easy cooker cutty answers that who wouldn't want certainty in such an uncertain world? But those views become very simplistic and very hardened and close down other perspectives to the detriment of their experience, I think. But I totally empathize why it's so seductive. If you go, here's the problem, here's the cause of the problem. Oh yeah, that's much more appealing than, I don't really understand the problem. I certainly don't understand the cause, who's to blame, and so on. And again, it's this idea of being able to think a bit more critically about things in a place of safety. I draw a parallel a little bit with the cancel culture. So one of the things I observe with the cancel culture, and I mean even people being fired because the company's afraid of what they've done might blow back. What I'm really picking up on is there's no chance for redemption. There's no chance to learn. Like if I've done something to hurt you and I just kind of get cut off, there's no chance for me really to learn why I hurt you, what that was like for you, how to change my view so that I don't hurt anyone else. It's just like no nuance, no curiosity. It's just like. The other thing I pick up on is sometimes people have to fumble through their understanding to get to the deeper truth and meaning. But sometimes for me to fumble through to understand, I might say things that aren't appropriate, that might offend, that might be difficult. But if I'm completely shut down in that process, I'm not going to get to the other side.
I think those things are just part of the process. And to your point about the importance of contrast, one could argue they're necessary.
Should I say more about that?
Well, I'm mostly referring to what you said about what if I hurt someone? What if I make mistakes? What if I hurt myself? All of that. I'm just simply saying, let's assume those things were necessary.
Necessary to hurt?
To get you to, wherever you went as a result.
Oh, yeah. So, because there's this thing between the difference between intention and impact. So I might say something that really upsets you, but that was not my intention.
Mm.
So what happens is people go, well, but it wasn't my intention to hurt you, Emma.
Mm.
But then I closed down the opportunity to understand, but it still had an impact.
Mm.
Right? So it's a bit like, I don't know whether you noticed it was a huge story about the BAFTAs in the UK where the kid with Tourette's
I'm not familiar.
He said a couple that, so there was a kid there. He's a grown man. It's a big movie called I Swear, and it's about a drama about a real guy who had Tourette's.
Mm.
So two black actors got up to take an award for Sinners, and as they get up, he said a couple of racial slurs. Right, that if you understand Tourette's, can understand how it happens, right? But it still had an impact. So it's very important to recognize that even though that was not the young man's intention, it's had a huge impact on people. Mm. And I think sometimes that we focus on intention, and then the impact gets lost.
Yes. Yeah.
And again, that takes us to enter a space that is uncomfortable and difficult and challenging to have that conversation.
Mm.
Both are true.
Yeah.
Both. Here's somebody who's suffering from an affliction that they have no control over and who's trying to bring attention to it to a broader audience. And then here's two people at a peak moment in their life that gets overshadowed briefly with this terrible experience that they had.
Right.
It's complex.
It is complex. Yeah.
Is there anything I needed to ask you, or you wanted me to ask you, or would it
maybe to circle back to the conditions under which we met, with the anechoic chamber, with your experience in there? I don't think I really very clearly answered your question before about, where are we going with all of this? And where we're going is, historically, we have always relied on people to come to us in order to experience our facility, to be immersed in our practice. And over the past 2-3 years, as I've been running this Therapeutics program, it's based in Minneapolis exclusively. It's based out of the Anechoic Chamber exclusively. And we have many people come in from all over the world for sessions. I have clients that are local, international. And we would, in addition to that, like to see this potential therapeutic modality being developed far outside of the walls of our building. We'd like to see how it can manifest into various wellness environments, various therapeutic environments, various medical environments, corporate environments. So we're looking at how a physical space can be developed that resembles the experience of the anechoic chamber, to help all sorts of populations of people, because it is so broad. My clients are so broad in their demographics. And part of that is about feeling that we owe it to our clients to also to come to them. And part of it is that we feel that we're on the edge of what could be a really significant modality.
Yeah, I mean, I concur. I'm really taken by the depth of your knowledge, your thoughtfulness, your experience, and your curiosity, and your desire to bring it to more people, because I think it'd be helpful. I think it's going to happen in a big way. Yeah. Do you think Steve will come on
to the podcast?
Yeah,
absolutely. I think he would love to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I always feel enriched, expanded, inspired, left with the feeling of I want to do more in the world. I think I said to you, you're an old soul. I hope that wasn't an insult.
Not at all.
The depth of your knowledge and your presence speaks to me of someone who's been around for a long time.
That could be true.
many lifetimes, I think.
Speaking of lack of certainty versus certainty, on that one, I live in the realm of uncertainty, and to be honest, I'm perfectly content there.
Yeah, I mean, I remain in the area of uncertainty, but when I meet people like you, and then I meet people who have a connection with like you, I go, that's something more than just this, surely. But maybe that's my own fantasy. But I mean it as a deep compliment to
you.
Who you are. It's an absolute pleasure, both you and Steve. So thank you for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your trip. So if you're talking to Steve, send him my love. I will be in touch.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely will.
I'll reach out to him. So let's speak soon. Enjoy yourself. And
Thank you.
I'll catch up. Thank you. Catch up when you get back.
Beautiful. All right. We'll talk soon.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.